poisoned, suffocated, left in prison to rot, decapitated, resurrected and zombified, banished into the abyss of space. All scenarios that were part of our childhood thanks to Nickelodeon. So today we're ranking Nick Toon villain fates, gruesome to most disturbing. And we'll kick things off with the characters who got off way easier than they should have. These villains got light punishment. Undoubtedly the easiest ending a Nick Toon's villain has ever gotten is that of Morag from the first Loud House movie. A series as lighthearted as this one doesn't usually delve into the larger scale villainous figures. So for the movie to throw in a lady who's guilty of attempted usurpation, terrorism, and attempted mass murder of children was pretty shocking. So how is she punished for the frankly horrific crimes she committed, you ask? Well, she's taken to a deserted island that is deserted save for some noisy seals, by Layla the Dragon, who she brainwashed to commit all those aforementioned crimes. And now that could be argued as a fitting punishment, but it's a shame that she was swiftly rescued by Angus and re-employed at Loch Loud, this time as a groundskeeper. Sure, she'll be under the constant surveillance of a gigantic dragon, but this woman did enough to get multiple life sentences, or in some states, a free ride in the electric chair. Angus is just way too nice of a guy, but he's still smart enough to keep her under control, which we have to respect. The fact is, she'll be employed and living in relative comfort for the rest of her days, which is a pretty sweet deal for someone who just got done trying to kill 11 kids. If we're gonna talk about characters who got away with child abuse though, we can't avoid talking about Vicky. Admittedly, Vicky doesn't fit the mold of most characters in today's discussion. There's no particular episode where she gets permanent repercussions for her actions. Although there are a few where she gets fired, that's always undone at the end. The most notorious thing about this is the fact that Vicky is guilty of countless acts of child abuse and just basic straight up terrorism as well. Even in later seasons where she barely shows up outside of cameos, it's always to remind us that she's a total psychopath through and through. Despite all this, she rarely faces any consequences. The worst that will happen is her having a bad day because of Timmy's wishes, but since the status quo always returns to normal at some point, we can't really say she's suffered too horribly. Unfortunately, any kid who needs a babysitter will, in fact, suffer horribly as long as she's given free rein. Following Vicky is another kid-hating woman, Coco from Rugrats in Paris. Now, this one is admittedly more ambiguous since we never actually see what happens to Coco following her misdeeds. It's safe to say she lost her job, having been exposed as an underhanded fraud to a huge crowd of people. And while that is pretty bad, it's honestly the bare minimum that she deserves. I mean, she wanted to lie and cheat her way into a loveless marriage so she could get a promotion. So naturally, when that failed, she'd lose the position she already had. Sometimes the simpler a fate is, the crueler it is, though for Coco, she has a lot more cartoonishly brutal fates to compete with. But let's talk about Goldfin. All things considered, Goldfin got dealt a pretty merciful hand. He was definitely the most despicable character in Tales of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, being willing to betray his entire species, not to mention his two best friends, for a shot at riches. The guy's a scumbag to be sure, but in the end, he managed to seemingly escape any legal repercussions for his actions. And as sad as it was to watch him abandon his friends, it's still a choice he himself decided to make, so there isn't too much sympathy to be had for this guy, sadly. But let's close out this category with Zim from Invader Zim. Considering how Zim's whole goal is to bring doom to the Earth and all its inhabitants, we usually don't feel sorry for him during all the ridiculous ways he fails at every attempt to achieve his goal. From escaping a small UFO convention only to land in a much larger one, to accidentally replacing his brain with a rubber piggy. Zim has definitely been through some serious stuff, but considering the absolute atrocities the little guy has committed, from literally organ harvesting to torture to attempted mass murder, none of his fates are really undeserved. What's more is that, inexplicably, Zim always bounces back, and while he faces occasional punishments for his crimes, they're pretty light stuff compared to what he's actually supposed to be enduring. Think about it. The other Urkins want him dead or exiled. Sizzlor wants him forced into lifelong food service.
Nobody escapes from Sizzlor.
And Dib wants to expose and potentially have him dissected, all of which would be horrific endings for the little invader.
My master's in trouble!
With that in mind, I'm sure getting maimed every couple of episodes sounds quite preferable in comparison. He also has to deal with Gur as a coworker, which, yeah, that's probably pretty brutal. I love Gur, don't get me wrong, I just wouldn't want him in charge of any of my equipment. But with that, let's move on to the characters who faced more official comeuppance for their crimes. These are the villains who faced some sort of legal repercussion. Bill Bluff, the richest man in Bluffington, is first up. While he's never a full-on villain, except for in the movie, Bill here was always arrogant and willing to put others down if it meant getting ahead in life. If you're willing to count the Doug movie in today's discussion, and we are, then you have to take into account that he was also willing to dump a large enough amount of pollution to turn a lizard into this blue version of Barney, I guess. He was also willing to kill that monster through any means necessary, child endangerment included, if it meant covering his own tracks. Thankfully, when his daughter rightfully calls him out on his scummy plan, he decides to make a public statement to stop his pollution, and even volunteers to clean up the very lake he soiled. It's the bare minimum, sure, and this is more like a case of him escaping legal trouble than anything else, but Bill Bluff doesn't seem like the type of guy to do volunteer work if he isn't being forced to. As a result, this one still counts as a pretty significant and basically unavoidable punishment. From one character who got a shot at redemption to another, Kavira from Legend of Korra is up next, and I'm sure that description probably turned a few heads. Kavira in the show was pretty much a pure evil character, guilty of numerous war crimes, mass murder, terrorism, crimes against humanity, you know, all that silly stuff. The fact that she got anything less than the death penalty is nothing short of a miracle. But the Korra spin-off comics allowed her to have a, and I use this phrase very loosely, redemption arc. In other words, she does some stuff to help Korra, is shown to be remorseful for her actions, and this is apparently enough for her to be sentenced to house arrest instead of life in prison. She's just a weird character to give a redemption arc to, honestly, and considering all she did, she kinda hit the lottery with her punishment. Getting a significantly worse punishment for significantly less crime is Sloane Blackburn, the villain of the Wild Thornberrys movie. But just because he's not a war criminal doesn't mean he's much better. Sloane and his missus are both guilty of a lot of animal cruelty, and they'll do anything to get the target they've got their sights set on. This guy was so depraved, he was willing to use dynamite explosions to scare off some elephants into running into an electric fence. That's the kind of plan that makes Scar from The Lion King look like a minor inconvenience to the jungle at most. Attempting mass murder against an endangered species and proceeding to throw the child who saved them into a waterfall wouldn't make any jury very sympathetic towards him. Not to mention that he's gonna be separated by his wife, who he actually seems to love. I guess everybody has their good side, right? Now, let's talk about a character we actually wanted to see redeem herself, Azula. Look, I know she's a divisive character, but come on. Seeing that absolute mental breakdown she had after her loss against Zuko and Katara was pretty brutal. That's the look of a girl who's totally lost it, all because she didn't have a tea-loving uncle to mentor her. Well, I guess she technically did, actually. But in any case, Azula still deserved some comeuppance for her actions, and being admitted to a mental hospital after the events of the series was pretty much the only fate fitting for her. Even when she strong-armed Zuko into taking her along on one of his missions, she was still under the Fire Lord and the Avatar's supervision, which means it's unlikely Azula will ever be able to act with total freedom again. That is, unless she actually chooses to reform and stop being a power-hungry monster, which, yeah, better get used to that cell, Azula. What he lacks in size, Sheldon J. Plankton makes up for in sheer magnitude of his plans. Sure, on paper, all he wants is to steal the Krabby Patty's secret formula. But don't be fooled, Plankton always has a bigger plan in mind.
I will rule the world!
When he finally gets enough time to use the formula in the SpongeBob SquarePants movie, which was originally the finale of the whole series, by the way, we see that he fully intended to make Bikini Bottom a monument to himself, forcing all its residents into slavery. You gotta commend the guy for not being all talk when it comes to world domination, but unfortunately for Plankton, the power of music was enough to free Bikini Bottom from his control. As a result, after taking the most brutal trampling he's ever received throughout the series, which is saying a lot, the The now flattened Plankton is locked up in the Institution for the Criminally Tiny. Whether you place this movie at the end of the timeline or not, this is a prison specifically designed for tiny criminals, meaning Plankton would have a much harder time escaping. And that's not to mention that he's flat as a pancake, and will no doubt be under close surveillance 24/7 as a result of his crimes. In short, no Plankton. That was not hilarious, everybody.
Come on, I was just kidding. I will destroy all of you.
But at least Plankton will have another shot at stealing that sweet, sweet formula. Let's move on to the bad guys who weren't so lucky. Put plain and simple, these Nick Toon bad guys are dead. But which ones met the most brutal ends? First and foremost, we have a pair who went out on their own terms. Eamon and Tarlock. The Equalists were a terrorist group, plain and simple. They wanted to get rid of bending powers entirely to equalize society, which some speculate is why they were called the Equalists in the first place. I mean, crazy fan theories, am I right? Eamon, being the leader of the bunch, was guilty of some brutal crimes, but not so many that he wasn't willing to try again after his defeat. Unfortunately, Tarlock saw through that admittedly cool-looking mask of his. His freedom-fighting brother had become the furthest thing from a hero, and more like their abusive father than anything. His blowing up the ship was an act of mercy towards not just others, but to themselves.
It's over, brother.
If that single teardrop says anything, even Eamon knew there was no shot at a new life for these two. Now, if that got too depressing for you, worry not. Unilac's death was much more justified, even if it had way worse consequences. I mean, really, as a guy who wanted to usher in a 10,000-year period of sheer darkness and chaos,
10,000 years of darkness begins.
death is almost merciful compared to what he deserved. Like, dude, you literally tried to unleash Satan on the world until the year 12,024. Getting murked by your niece is a pretty easy way to go, even if I highly doubt the afterlife is gonna be super merciful towards you. Nor will the Avatar fandom, since you effectively destroyed the Avatar cycle for, what reason again? Summoning the evil kite thing? Jeez, this guy sucked. The first major Avatar villain defeat, Admiral Zhao, had things a bit rougher than Korra's creepy uncle. In comparison to Unilac, who was at least on relatively equal footing with Korra during their fight, Zhao was killed by a bigger and badder nemesis, the consequences of his actions. The Ocean Spirit didn't take kindly to him killing the Moon Spirit, so it decided a means of justice of pulling him down to the depths of the sea to presumably drown his way over to the spirit world. That said, even if this one were more brutal than it already is, we wouldn't place it any lower on the sheer basis that Zuko at least offered to help save his life. It's like the old saying goes, pride goes before being drowned by a giant sentient wave. But now let's get into the really painful stuff, like the death of Lasombra from Hey Arnold. Like most of his villains at this point, he definitely did more than enough to earn his comeuppance. When you're a grown man fully willing to endanger and kill children, there isn't much of a death that feels like too much for you. For Lasombra, he was struck by a booby-trap poison dart to the forehead and fell into a canyon, which you'd assume would kill someone. But in an act of sheer cartoonish dedication to his evil, Lasombra somehow managed to climb back up the cliff, get into a scuffle with his doppelganger, if that's a word, Eduardo, and only then does he finally succumb to the poison and fall to his death. That had to have hurt a lot, and the craziest part is that he could have just given up and saved himself the trouble. I guess you can't say that he went down without a fight though. Still, that dart really knocked the wind out of his sails. Speaking of which, next up is the Earth Queen. While she's one of the more minor antagonists, we had to include her in today's ranking for the sole fact that Nickelodeon somehow greenlit this scene of a woman having the air literally sucked out of her lungs, suffocating her to death while she could do nothing to stop it, forced to listen to Zahir roast her as she breathes her last, or rather doesn't breathe her last breath. Look on the bright side, Earth Queen. Thanks to you, we finally know what would have happened if SpongeBob had put Sandy's helmet on. But let's talk about the demise of Jimmy Neutron's enemies, which requires us to go way back in time. While this series is more episodic in general, the series finale, The League of Villains, finally brings the bulk of Jimmy's old nemesis back for one last shot at defeating him for good.
Goodbye, Jimmy Neutron!
Oh, sorry. One last shot at defeating him for evil.
We can wipe him off the face of the galaxy and let evil triumph!
Sadly for them though, they'd end up losing. Try to contain your shock. Long story short, most of them end up stuck in the Cretaceous era, which is like right after the Jurassic one. They're not only stuck in a completely different era of time with no way to get back home, they're being hunted down by dinosaurs, and Baby Eddie only has so many diapers to fend them off with.
Well, say hello to my little friend, 5-day-old diaper.
I know Jimmy's kind of a morally questionable kid, but geez, just lock them up or something. You could almost call that, say the line Bart, a fate worse than death. That's what we're talking about next. First up, we have the villain of everyone's almost least favorite Nick Toon, Dorcas from Planet Sheen. This might be controversial since having to deal with an annoying kid bugging you 24/7 doesn't sound nearly as bad as being eaten alive by a dinosaur or drowned by a demigod. Like, at this point, why don't we just put Squidward at the top spot? But well, that's the thing. Think of Squidward, but like seasons 6 and 7 Squidward, where he's just minding his own business and getting his life turned around by his friend, not by choice. That's Dorcas, basically. And he has to deal with the fact that the whole planet loves the guy who destroyed his home, stole his job, and just constantly remains a thorn in his side in general. Carl would have never done him like this. Shaking my head. But now, let's talk about a real villain. Shredder needs no introduction for us cartoon veterans. He's the main villain of the TMNT franchise, and in most iterations of the series, he fits that bill perfectly fine. The 2012 cartoon being no exception. He's a man who gave up his humanity in favor of sheer, unadulterated hatred and being mutated beyond recognition into Super Shredder. He's ultimately taken down by Leonardo, with a decapitated head as proof.
Shredder is finished.
Still though, that kinda sounds normal by this list's standards, right? Shredder had a pretty painful death, sure, but at least now he can finally rest from all that stressful hatred. Is what I would say if Cavaxis and the Foot Clan hadn't brought this dude back to life to use as a zombie soldier. It's shocking to see a kid series go so dark with its villain deaths, if you can even call this a proper death, that is. But for some characters, death seems like it'd be more of a mercy. Cavaxis from My Life as a Teenage Robot was determined to get Jenny to join Cluster Prime. That pursuit would be her undoing though, and her crimes would ultimately get her banished from the planet on an asteroid to think about what she had done. From then on out, Vexus learned that it was important to let people choose their own paths in life. And I'm just kidding, she goes crazy and makes a hamster-sized escape pod. Yeah, loss of power did some crazy stuff to Vexus's mind, sadly, but it didn't change her obsession with seeking revenge on Jenny. Once she makes her grand return, she poses as a popular girl to, mess with her. And yeah, that's really it. She went from the ruler of an entire planet to an adult trying to blend in with teenagers to spite another teenager. And honestly, that's just sad, man. Kind of pathetic, actually. We really live in a society where Zahir got less of a redemption than Kavira. Sure, this guy is outwardly a lot more brutal than her. Let's not forget how he murdered the Earth Queen on screen in this literal children's show. Yeah, Nickelodeon, Invader Zim was totally the one taking things too far. Anyway, Zahir was an anarchist through and through. Ironically, in the end, that conviction cost him quite literally everything but the conviction itself. He watched all his friends die in combat and is presumably in prison for life.
You see what I did there? I put a sock in it. Literally.
With his last on-screen action being to help Korra overcome her trauma so she can defeat Kavira. If nothing else, he showed some semblance of humanity in that moment. And while he didn't fully redeem himself, he at least went out with one decent deed. With that though, we've reached the bottom 3 for the most brutal villain demises in Nicktoons history. So let's talk about the leaders of the Urkin Empire, the almighty tallest. Now look, as evil as Zim is, we can't be the only ones who always wanted the tallest to get some payback for how they treated him, right? Not to mention how they treated literally every other Urkin, seeing them as all beneath them. That very arrogance would be their downfall, as their refusal to turn their ship under any circumstance would lead them right into the Florpus hole.
Why are you so negative?
And that would result in them being turned into puppets and burned alive for who knows how long. The ambiguous, bizarre nature of this ending made it the one we thought belonged at number 1. But then we remembered one crucial, invaluable detail, and that is that Invader Zim is a really weird show where the characters can endure some of the most bizarrely messed up stuff you've ever seen and still be back normal in the next episode, as evidenced by the tallest still being, alive in the comics. Still, it it was nice finally seeing those two knocked off their high horse. But next up, let's talk about Fire Lord Ozai. But first, this video is brought to you by Wicked Binge channel memberships. You can gain access to our videos early before anyone else, plus get members-only emojis and loyalty badges by supporting the channel through a membership.
Oh my god! Wow!
The main antagonist of Avatar: The Last Airbender, this guy is one of the greatest villains in Nickelodeon history, and it's for one simple reason. He's just straight up diabolical. He's an abuser, a war criminal, a terrorist, basically every violent type of crime you can think of. If Aang went absolutely anime mental breakdown on this guy, I doubt anyone would have blamed him, but this is a kid's show, so they had to give him a non-violent end. As a result, Ozai is stripped of the one and only thing that ever mattered to him, his throne. His crown is given over to Zuko, the son he rejected, and even more cruelly, his bending is stripped away.
I took his bending away.
And he's left to rot in prison for what he's done. It's about the worst ending you could give a guy who devoted his entire life to the pursuit of power and influence. Just as he was on the cusp of gaining all of it, he lost every bit of progress he'd worked for. In other words, good job, Aang. But while this may be controversial, there's one Nick Toon's villain we think had an even rougher finale than Ozai. We're giving the gold medal of brutality to Vlad Plasmius from Danny Phantom. Similarly to Ozai, Vlad lost everything in his ruthless pursuit of power. His resentment of Jack for accidentally turning him into the ghostly monster he was made him blind to everything else, and in the end, he blackmailed the world into giving him $500 billion and world rulership in exchange for saving the planet from a disastrous asteroid known as the Disasteroid. After he reveals his resentment towards Jack and threatens to steal his wife, emphasis on steal because Vlad does not respect women, he finds out to his horror that the comet doesn't respond to ghost energy. As a result, having burned bridges with the one friend he had left, Vlad was abandoned in space to float on a rock in solitude forever. At best, mind you, he'd be given a merciful ending by getting crushed by a giant space rock. At worst, he'd spend years in loneliness, and if some 10 years later art by Butch Hartman was any indication, potentially get held captive as a slave by some aliens. On top of all this, unlike Ozai, Vlad was once a somewhat okay person, or at least not a complete monster. He let hatred totally consume his humanity to the point where he ended up completely and utterly alone in the world, with only the cold yet bittersweet release of death to look forward to. Coming up next, Fanboy and Chum Chum, only on Nicktoons.